Welcome to a new episode of the Heroic History Podcast.
Today, we're diving deep into British foreign policy.
Yeah, it's a fascinating topic, and we've got a really interesting mix of sources for this one.
We do.
Historical analysis,
Yeah.
geopolitical strategy. We've even got some stuff on nuclear proliferation and even space strategy.
Yeah, see a bit of a blend.
And the rise of proxy warfare.
The mission here is to unpack how Britain navigates the global landscape.
Yeah.
Particularly its relationship with the United States.
It's that special relationship everyone talks about, but what does it actually mean?
Right.
In practice, is Britain really a global power?
Well,
Or is it more of a lieutenant to the American superpower?
that's the question, isn't it?
It is.
To understand that dynamic, I think we need to look back at Britain's history.
Okay.
Its transition from a vast empire to what some call a residual great power.
So how does shedding an empire with all its global reach, how does that impact a country's foreign policy outlook?
It's fascinating. Even after losing its colonies, Britain seemed to retain a yearning for a prominent place on the world stage.
Okay.
And the special relationship with the U.S. is key to understanding this post-empire role.
So it kind of fills the void left by the empire.
In a way.
But, we have to remember, this relationship has evolved over time.
Absolutely.
It's had moments of close alignment and, periods of tension.
Yes, consider, for example, the Anglo-American military interventions in the Middle East.
Right.
Particularly the Iraq War.
Yeah.
These joint operations illustrate the complexities
I do.
where shared goals sometimes mask underlying tensions.
The sources highlight the potential pitfalls of this reliance on the U.S.,
Yeah.
especially after Brexit. There's a sense that Britain's global influence is increasingly tied to American power.
We see evidence of this in the UK's increased procurement of American arms
Right.
and the push for a global NATO.
Yeah.
Some analysts view this as an attempt to solidify American leadership on a global scale
Okay.
and ensure Britain's place within that structure.
It raises a question about resources.
Yeah.
Britain allocates a lot of its budget to defense, more than many other nations. But its economic strength isn't quite on par with its military ambitions.
Right.
Could this disparity ultimately limit its global aspirations?
It's a key insight. There's a tension between Britain's desire for a strong military presence and its ability to sustain it financially.
Yeah.
And this will likely shape British foreign policy for years to come.
Okay, let's move to a tactic that's become increasingly prevalent in the 21st century. Proxy warfare.
Okay.
It's where countries use third parties to wage conflicts indirectly.
Right. It's a bit like a global game of chess.
Right.
With players maneuvering their pieces across the board,
Yeah.
but with significantly higher stakes.
Yeah. The U.S. National Defense Strategy acknowledges this.
Yes.
It specifically says that proxy warfare is a tactic used by rivals like Iran and Russia.
It's almost like a hall of mirrors.
Yeah.
Both sides claiming to be the responsible ones while accusing the other of engaging in proxy warfare.
It's very murky.
It is.
And it's interesting because the concept of effects-based operations, which was originally developed as an American military doctrine,
Right.
is now being utilized by groups like Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps.
It's a form of proxy warfare that emphasizes achieving maximum impact with minimal direct involvement.
So it seems like a lot of actors are trying to exert influence from the shadows.
Yes.
But the consequences of those actions can be really hard to predict or to control.
Exactly. This raises some challenging ethical and strategic dilemmas.
Yeah.
Proxy wars, like those we've seen in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria,
Right.
are notoriously complex and often lead to unintended consequences.
Yeah.
They also circumvent democratic processes, as decisions about military action are often made without public scrutiny.
It's a shadowy world of conflict,
It is.
and accountability is elusive.
And that lack of transparency makes it all the more concerning.
All right, let's shift our focus to something that's been a defining feature of global security for decades.
Yeah.
Nuclear weapons.
Okay.
It's fascinating and terrifying.
The nuclear age introduced an unprecedented level of complexity to global security.
Yeah.
It's important to remember that even fission bombs, like those used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, possess immense destructive power.
One source mentioned that the Nagasaki bomb contained just 6 kilograms of plutonium.
Right.
It's chilling to think about how such a small amount of material could cause such widespread devastation.
Then there are thermonuclear bombs,
Right.
hydrogen bombs, which are even more powerful,
Yeah.
with yields measured in megatons.
Millions of tons of TNT. It's almost impossible to grasp the scale of destruction these weapons represent.
It is.
But for decades, they formed the basis of a chilling logic. Deterrence.
Right.
The idea that the threat of mutually assured destruction would prevent either side from actually using these weapons.
It was a risky strategy, but it did prevent a direct nuclear conflict between the superpowers.
But there were close calls.
Many.
And the possibility of an accidental nuclear war was very real.
Oh, yes.
One of the sources detailed a U.S. nuclear war plan called SIOP-62.
Right.
It was a first strike plan that targeted cities in the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, and even China.
Wow.
The projected casualties were in the hundreds of millions.
It's a stark reminder of how close humanity came to the brink of unimaginable disaster.
And it's a bit unnerving to consider that even after the Cold War ended, the U.S. continued to develop and modernize its nuclear arsenal.
The non-proliferation efforts are ongoing,
Right.
but the U.S. itself plays a complicated role.
Yeah.
It strives to prevent countries like North Korea from acquiring nuclear weapons while simultaneously maintaining and upgrading its own arsenal.
So nuclear weapons remain a defining factor in global security, but the dynamics have evolved significantly since the Cold War.
And with new actors like North Korea entering the nuclear club, the future of deterrence is anything but certain.
Well, on that sobering note, let's shift gears to a topic that's both exciting and potentially unsettling: space.
Okay.
Space is no longer just the domain of scientific exploration.
It's becoming increasingly militarized,
It is.
with major powers competing for influence and control.
It's like a science fiction movie come to life, with all the potential for both wonder and danger.
Right.
What are the strategic considerations in space? It's such a vast and unfamiliar environment.
One way to think about it is to consider the unique geopolitical factors at play.
Okay.
For example, gravity wells and radiation belts act as strategic choke points in space, much like straits or mountain passes do on Earth.
So even though space is vast, there are still locations that hold strategic importance.
Exactly.
Okay.
That's why the creation of the U.S. Space Force is such a significant development.
Right.
It reflects a shift in thinking,
Okay.
a recognition that space is a potential battleground.
And with the development of space weapons like anti-satellite weapons and the potential for space-based lasers,
Right.
the possibility of conflict in this domain becomes even more real.
Imagine a scenario where satellites are targeted,
Yeah.
disrupting communications and navigation systems across the globe.
The impact would be felt worldwide.
It would.
It's a chilling thought, not to mention the ethical implications.
Right.
Satellites are instrumental in global surveillance.
Yes.
And the expansion of the surveillance state already raises concerns about privacy and civil liberties.
If space becomes a militarized zone, those concerns will only intensify.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive.
We have.
From the historical legacy of empire to the potential for conflict in space.
It's a complex and fascinating landscape, and we've only just scratched the surface.
But before we move on, there's one crucial region we need to examine more closely. The Middle East.
Okay.
It's a region of vital strategic importance for both the U.S. and Britain. And understanding their interests and actions in this area is crucial to grasping the bigger picture of British foreign policy.
Absolutely. And that's where we'll pick up in the next part of our deep dive. The Middle East, it's a region brimming with complexity, isn't it?
It is.
You've got ancient rivalries,
Right.
shifting political alliances, and of course, the vast oil reserves.
Yeah, those oil reserves.
Yeah.
I was really struck by how some of the sources emphasized the dependence of the Gulf monarchies on Western arms sales.
Yeah.
It seems like a lucrative business, but
It is.
what's the bigger picture?
It's about more than just profit.
Right.
These arms deals play a significant role in shaping the security landscape of the region.
Okay.
You know, consider the example of the largest arms deal in history
Yeah.
between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia,
Right.
worth hundreds of billions of dollars.
It's a lot.
These agreements solidify alliances and ensure a degree of Western influence.
It's interesting because on the one hand, it seems like a win-win. You know, Western powers get to sell sophisticated weaponry.
You're right.
They maintain a strategic presence in the region.
Yeah.
But some sources raise ethical concerns about these deals,
Yeah.
especially given the humanitarian crisis in Yemen,
Right.
which has been partly fueled by arms sales to Saudi Arabia.
It highlights the difficult balancing act that countries often face in foreign policy.
It does.
How do you weigh strategic interests against ethical considerations?
Right.
Especially when dealing with complex situations like the conflict in Yemen.
It's a tough question, and there are no easy answers.
No.
And speaking of complex situations, the U.S. has been talking about an Asia pivot for years, suggesting a shift in focus away from the Middle East.
Yeah.
But it seems unlikely they'll completely abandon a region.
Right.
That holds such strategic importance, especially when it comes to controlling those crucial oil resources.
Control over energy resources translates to global power.
Yeah,
And the U.S. understands that.
they do.
So while there may be talk of shifting priorities,
Right.
the reality on the ground suggests a continued commitment to the region.
It seems like disentangling from the cycle of conflict in the Middle East would require a pretty fundamental reassessment of interests,
I agree.
priorities, and strategies for everyone involved.
It's a challenge that policymakers will continue to grapple with for the foreseeable future.
It is.
Now, if we shift gears a bit, there's another aspect of foreign policy we need to explore:
Okay.
the use of financial tools to achieve geopolitical goals.
You're talking about the weaponization of finance.
I am.
Okay, that came up in a few of the sources.
It did.
And it sounds like a pretty powerful tool.
It is. Essentially, it involves leveraging the dominance of the U.S. dollar
Okay.
and the global financial system to exert pressure on adversaries.
Okay, so we're not talking about traditional trade wars here.
No, we're not.
Okay.
This is about imposing sanctions,
Right.
restricting access to international markets,
Okay.
and essentially cutting off countries from the global economy.
It sounds like a financial blockade.
It is.
What kind of impact does that have on the targeted countries?
The effects can be devastating.
Oh,
Take the example of Iran,
right.
which has been subjected to crippling sanctions for decades.
Right.
Its economy has been severely hampered.
Yeah.
Its currency has been devalued,
Right.
and its people have suffered as a result.
The sources mentioned that the U.S. has even gone after European banks
They have.
that violated its sanctions on Iran,
Right.
slapping them with massive fines.
It demonstrates the reach of American influence.
It does.
They can effectively dictate financial behavior on a global scale, even among their allies.
Wow.
And it's not just limited to Iran.
Right.
The U.S. has employed similar tactics against countries like Venezuela,
Yeah.
Cuba, and even Russia.
The sources specifically highlighted how the U.S. threatened to isolate Russia from the global financial system after its invasion of Ukraine.
They even targeted the Russian central bank, which is essentially the heart of their economy.
Wow.
It was an attempt to cripple their ability to finance the war
Right.
and pressure the government to change course.
I think it is a form of financial warfare with the goal of achieving political objectives through economic means.
It is, but it's important to acknowledge that sanctions often have unintended consequences.
Okay.
They can harm ordinary citizens,
Yeah.
exacerbate humanitarian crises, and even push countries closer to America's rivals.
It seems like a risky strategy.
It is.
You might achieve your short-term objective, but
Right.
there's always the potential for unintended consequences that could backfire in the long run.
Exactly. It's a delicate balancing act.
Yeah.
And the effectiveness of sanctions is debatable.
Right.
Their long-term impact is often unpredictable, and there are valid concerns about their ethical implications.
Okay, well, from financial warfare, let's shift our attention to a more traditional domain of power. The world's oceans.
Okay.
The seas have always been vital for global trade,
Right.
security, and power projection.
The idea of freedom of the seas has been a cornerstone of international law for centuries.
It has.
But as with most rules, there are exceptions.
Right.
And the U.S., despite championing this principle, has often acted in ways that seem to contradict it.
That's interesting. It sounds a bit like a double standard.
It does a bit.
What are some examples of this?
Well, historically, the U.S. Navy has engaged in blockades, intercepted ships, and even asserted exclusive rights over certain waters.
Right.
All actions that seem to clash with the idea of freedom of the seas.
It seems a bit hypocritical.
It does.
If you're going to advocate for a rule,
Yeah,
you should probably follow it yourself, right?
you'd think so.
Yeah.
But when it comes to protecting its own interests, the U.S. has shown a willingness to bend or even break the rules,
Right.
even those it helped create.
Right.
And this selective application of international law creates a sense of hypocrisy
Yes.
and undermines the legitimacy of the rules-based order that the U.S. claims to uphold.
Yeah, it also raises questions about who these rules truly benefit.
It does.
Are they designed to maintain a level playing field,
Right.
or do they primarily serve the interests of the powerful?
That's a debate that's likely to continue as competition for resources and influence on the high seas intensifies.
Okay, now let's dive a bit deeper into the history of naval power and how it's evolved over time.
Naval dominance has shifted dramatically over the centuries. Britain once ruled the waves,
Right.
its navy projecting power across the globe.
It did.
But as empires rise and fall, so too does naval supremacy.
Right.
The rise of the United States in the 20th century ushered in a new era.
World War II really showcased the power of American industrial might.
It did.
Their shipyards churned out thousands of warships.
It's incredible.
And by the end of the war, they had an unmatched naval force.
Those massive aircraft carriers became the ultimate symbol of American power.
They did.
These floating fortresses, capable of projecting air power anywhere in the world,
Right.
became a cornerstone of U.S. military strategy.
It's incredible to think about the scale and capability of these vessels.
It is.
They're like mobile military bases,
They are.
giving the U.S. a decisive advantage in any maritime conflict.
And their presence in strategically important regions like the Pacific and the Middle East serves as a constant reminder of American power.
It does.
But as technology continues to advance, the nature of naval warfare is evolving.
The sources talked about how submarines and other advanced weaponry are becoming increasingly important,
Right.
suggesting a shift away from the massive fleet battles of the past.
It's a fascinating evolution. We might be entering an era of more stealthy, unpredictable naval conflict,
Okay.
where technology plays an even greater role.
It seems like the rules of engagement are constantly changing both on land and at sea.
Absolutely. And as competition between major powers heats up, we can expect to see even more innovation in naval technology and strategy.
Control of the seas clearly remains a critical element of global power, but it's a game that's constantly changing.
And while the U.S. currently enjoys a position of dominance,
Right.
they will face new challenges as countries like China continue to develop their own naval capabilities.
Okay, from the vastness of the oceans, let's turn our attention to another domain that's becoming increasingly crucial in the 21st century. Cyberspace.
Okay.
Cyberspace is a fascinating and somewhat unsettling battleground. It's a realm where the lines between war and peace are blurred, and the rules of engagement are constantly shifting.
Right.
Sounds a bit like the Wild West,
Mm-hmm.
but with hackers and digital weapons instead of cowboys and gunslingers.
And the stakes are incredibly high.
They are.
Cyber attacks can disrupt critical infrastructure,
Yeah.
steal sensitive information,
No.
cripple financial systems, and even sow discord among populations.
That's a whole new dimension of warfare.
It is.
And it sounds like it has the potential to wreak havoc on a global scale.
The sources highlighted how countries like Russia and China have invested heavily in developing their cyber capabilities,
Right.
and they pose a significant threat to Western interests.
Yeah.
It's a constant cat-and-mouse game between those trying to exploit vulnerabilities and those working to defend against attacks.
It sounds like a never-ending battle with both sides constantly trying to outmaneuver each other in the digital realm.
And as our reliance on technology grows, so too does our vulnerability to these attacks. It's a challenge that requires constant vigilance and adaptation.
Okay, let's step back from the digital world for a moment
Right.
and consider a different kind of power. The power of ideology.
Okay.
How does that factor into a country's foreign policy?
Ideology has always played a role in shaping how countries view the world
Right.
and interact with others.
Okay.
It provides a framework for understanding global events,
Right.
justifying actions and mobilizing support. You could say it's the lens through which countries perceive their place on the world stage.
And in the post-Cold War era, we've seen various ideologies competing for dominance.
We have.
The U.S., for example, has long promoted democracy and free markets as universal values,
Right.
almost as if it were the inevitable endpoint of history.
The end of history narrative, as it's often called.
Right.
But as we've seen, history rarely follows a predetermined path.
It doesn't.
The rise of China, with its own distinct model of authoritarian capitalism,
Right.
challenges the notion that Western values are universally appealing.
And then there are ideologies like Islamism,
Yeah.
which have gained traction in parts of the Middle East and beyond.
Right.
One source discussed the rise of the Islamic State, a group that sought to establish a caliphate based on a radical interpretation of Islam.
Yes.
It's a stark reminder that ideology can be a powerful motivating force,
It can.
capable of inspiring both good and evil.
Understanding these competing ideologies is crucial for navigating the complexities of the 21st century.
It is okay. We've covered a lot of ground in this part of our deep dives.
We have.
From the volatile landscape of the Middle East to the shadowy world of cyberspace and the enduring power of ideology.
And through it all, we've seen how British foreign policy is intertwined with American hegemony, raising questions about its true level of independence on the world stage.
So what does the future hold for this special relationship?
Well,
is it destined to endure? Or are we witnessing a gradual decoupling?
Those are the questions we'll explore in the final part of our deep dive.
We've examined the historical backdrop, the economic realities, the complex interplay of global forces that shape British foreign policy.
But the central question remains.
It does.
What does the future hold for Britain's role on the world stage?
Right. Is it destined to remain closely aligned with the U.S.? Or will it chart a more independent course?
It's a fascinating question, especially given how Brexit has reshaped Britain's global standing. Some sources suggest that leaving the EU has left Britain seeking a new anchor for its foreign policy. There's a sense that having stepped out of one major power structure, the European Union, Britain is now looking to solidify its place within another, one where the U.S. plays a leading role.
It's almost like they're trying to trade one club membership for another.
The analogy is apt. But it's not just about finding a new group to belong to. There are genuine strategic and security interests that continue to bind the U.S. and Britain together.
The sources pointed to the concept of a global NATO, an idea championed by Britain as a potential framework for this continued partnership.
It's a strategic maneuver aimed at solidifying American leadership and countering the rise of China on the global stage. But it also carries certain risks.
Okay, what are those?
Well, one source highlighted the potential for Britain to become entangled in conflicts that don't directly threaten its own interests.
Okay, so almost like a junior partner getting pulled into the senior partner's battles.
That's a valid concern. And then there's the economic dimension to consider. Britain's economic challenges, which have been exacerbated by Brexit, could limit its ability to contribute meaningfully to any global alliance.
It's hard to be a reliable partner if you're struggling to manage your own affairs.
Indeed. This economic reality could put a strain on the special relationship, as the U.S. might become less inclined to support a partner perceived as a burden.
So the future of Anglo-American relations is far from certain. It's a complex equation with a lot of variables at play.
It is.
What stood out to me was how technology is reshaping the very nature of power and influence. From cyber warfare to the militarization of space, the tools of statecraft are evolving rapidly.
And those technological advancements will undoubtedly influence how countries like Britain define their role in the world. The ability to project power and influence is no longer solely determined by the size of your military or the strength of your economy.
It seems like we're entering an era where innovation and adaptability will be crucial for any nation hoping to exert influence on the global stage.
Absolutely. And for Britain, this means making strategic choices about where to invest its resources and expertise. Will it prioritize developing cutting-edge technologies, or will it focus on strengthening traditional alliances?
It's a pivotal moment, and the decisions made in the coming years will have a profound impact on Britain's future trajectory.
And as we've seen throughout this deep dive, these decisions will be made in a context of complex global power dynamics, where the actions of one nation inevitably ripple outward, affecting the interests and calculations of others.
So as we conclude our exploration of British foreign policy, we leave you with this thought.
In a world of shifting alliances, rapid technological change, and intensifying competition, how will Britain adapt and define its role in the 21st century?
It's a question with no easy answers. But one that deserves careful consideration as we witness the unfolding of this complex geopolitical drama.
Leave us your comments. We would like to know what you think. See you soon.